My name is Yvonne Nichols, and I'm an alcoholic. And I would like to thank the committee for asking me to come. This is my second trip down here. And I had really forgotten how many years ago it had been. It's absolutely amazing that I've run into so many people and that we are all still sober. I said a minute ago that I was an alcoholic, and my sobriety date, incidentally, is February the 11th of 1969. It's a hell of a long time. I should, be able to say to you that I've been sober since 1959. I was talking to Bob from Colorado, and I attended my first AA meeting in 1959, and I didn't even know where I went. He told me today it was on York Street or someplace, but I went to 2 meetings while I was working in Denver for a week, and I left those meetings, and I knew when I walked out in Denver that I was not an alcoholic, and so I had a little slip, and it lasted for 10 years. And all of the things that they said would happen did happen. And I guess right now you might say that I'm one of those old dinosaurs in AA. We're the people that the newcomers don't like, And I have earned my recognition and my seat. I get to sit on the back row of the meetings, and my hair bristles when I hear some of the things that are said in the speaker meetings. And I think the most upset sometimes that I get, and I'm going to tell you a true story, and take it for what it's worth, is when I go to a meeting and I identified myself as an alcoholic because that's what I'm in. I'm in an AA meeting. And I go to meetings and people start in describing all of the neurotic states that they may be in. They say, I'm an alcoholic and an overeater. I'm an alcoholic and I'm a sex fiend. And I'm an alcoholic and I'm an addict. And the truth of the matter is, if you're an alcoholic, it's going to cover the whole damn gamut. But in Dallas, Texas, there is a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. He is a black man, and he is the most decorated soldier in World War II. And he's tough, and he's mean. And he got sober on the streets. And so he went to a meeting, and the chairman was standing up there, and the chairman's a little wimpy guy, and he said, I'm Ralph, and I'm an alcoholic addict. And, or rather, no, he said, I'm Ralph, and I'm polydicted. That's a new one, polydicted. And so this veteran was sitting there, and he punched a guy next to him, and he said, what's polydicted? And the guy says, I don't know. And so after the meeting, the veteran went up to Ralph, and he called him aside, and he said, Ralph, he said, what's polydicted? This is an AA meeting. And Ralph said, well, polydicted. And the veteran says, no, you've been having sex with parrots? So, for those of you who are new, in spite of what your sponsors say, or your counselors, or whoever, I'm going to suggest to you that you get in the swim and you identify yourself at all AA meetings as just alcoholic, and all of us old-timers are going to know what the hell you're talking about. Yeah. I didn't get here until this afternoon. I had a prior commitment. Yesterday was my belly button birthday, and it also happened to be my 30th law school class reunion. Now then, if you have a husband, and this is just a word of advice, because a lot of you go to reunions, be they high school or college or whatever, there's nothing that is duller than for someone to go to a reunion that didn't go to your school, and they have to sit there. And so my husband said that the best birthday present that he could give to me was to go to that stupid reunion. And so he went, and I was the only girl in my graduating law class, and which was just wonderful. I think the enrollment now is 41% female. That's an improvement. But when I went, it was just like a dog in a meat house. It was just fantastic. Yes. The only thing is that what you need to do is that when you're going in the car, you know, to the reunion, it's kind of you're automatically with the alcoholic mind that I have. I'm saying, oh my God, I'm going to have to take a fifth step here or something because I know someone is going to say something. And so I'm going to have to kind of get him to anticipate, you know, what may be said. Particularly, we had a really bad drinking class. And if they're drinking alcohol, they'll probably try to, you know, recite some incident. So I'm driving along trying to just kind of superficially tell him some funny things that happened. Because I knew that someone else would say, it's always better you confess before they tell on you. And so when we got there, it was as expected. Everybody was drinking. They had an open cash bar. And lo and behold, there were 7 members of Alcoholics Anonymous in our class. Yeah. Now, if you want to see a group cloister, you put a bunch of AAs in a big reception with lots of whiskey, and you will see the quickest forming clique that you have ever found. And so we sat at our own table, and I had forgotten all of the different kinds of wines and things that they serve at those fancy dinners. And you had 2 or 3 wine glasses, and so all of our glasses, we put them upside down on the table, and it looked just like a bowling alley, you know? It was wonderful. And they served the salad, and I read chapter 5 at our table. But it was wonderful to go, and it was even better to leave and to know this morning who I went with, and, you know, not to have to go through all of the silly things that we all have experienced. And there was a lot of fun that was associated in those days, but by the same token, as you look back now and you can see the script, just in the history of the progressiveness of this craziness, because it was right after that, when I graduated from law school, that I had attended my first AA meeting. I had known about Alcoholics Anonymous for a long, long time. My mother is a member of this program, and last night was a big night for her. She attended the old timers meeting in Oklahoma City, and I guess is the oldest living with most years of sobriety woman in the state of Oklahoma. She has 37 years. And bless her heart, she was just beside herself. I called her this morning, and she was talking about how it seems to have changed. And she said, I don't remember all of these things that used to happen. And so I said, well, Mother, did they ask you to get up and talk? And she said, yes. And she said, I told them how it used to be in the olden days. She said, when we really had the nitty-gritty big book AA. And she said, Yvonne, you go down there to Corpus, and that's what I want you to talk about. She said, about how you came in and how AA used to be. And I said, well, I told her that I would do that. And she doesn't understand. She has cataracts, and she can't drive, and she can't get to a lot of meetings now unless people go by and pick her up. But it was through her association with people like you that I learned about Alcoholics Anonymous. I was raised in an alcoholic home, and as far back as I can remember, you know, all my parents did was fight. And we had the Saturday night fights before they even invented television. And they'd just fight, and then Daddy had filed for divorce, and then he'd pack a suitcase, and then he'd come back, and then he was off again, and it was just back and forth. We had absolutely no domestic tranquility. And I had a little brother who was 13 years younger than I, and he was really my charge, and I would take care of him because Mother would be drinking. And the two of us would go around the house, and we'd find the whiskey bottles. And I didn't experience anything that any of you who had an alcoholic parent didn't go through. Except in those days, they did not have Al-Anon, and Alateen, and Preteen, and Al-Top. None of that. All we knew was that she just got drunk and was obnoxious and gave us a lot of trouble. And so we would search the house to try to find the whiskey bottles. And we found them in the strangest places, in the back of the toilet tank. And we would find them underneath the house. She had a crawl space, and she'd hide them under there. We'd find them in the bottom of the laundry basket. And so my brother and I learned all the places. And so I would take him to the grocery store, and Oklahoma was dry at that time. We had bootleggers. And I'd take him to the grocery store, go on an errand, and we'd go home, and she'd be drunk. And I don't know how she did that so quickly. But she would have a bottle stashed, and so then we'd call Daddy, and we'd start the search. And this was just a daily routine. And so she started going to AA meetings. I didn't even know anything about it. All I know is that I was off to college, had been gone a couple of years, and all of a sudden, she quit drinking. And she had a little trouble when she first came in the program, but she quit drinking. And I thought she was going to church or someplace. And she had picked up some magazine, and it told about Alcoholics Anonymous. And she had made contact with someone in Oklahoma City, and they, golly, I bet they didn't have 12, 13 people. And so she told me that she was going to this group, and that they were all alcoholics, and that they had meetings and they studied about the disease of alcoholism. And she told me that she had an allergy of the body coupled with a mental compulsion to drink, and I didn't believe it. That's the silliest thing that I ever heard of. She drank because she chose to drink, and she's a drunk. And I didn't understand anything about willpower, compulsions. I just thought people ought to be able to quit drinking. But she kept getting involved with the people from this AA, the double A, and they kept coming over to the house, and they would have meetings around our kitchen table. And I was able to experience, I certainly didn't participate in, but I did listen to some of the foolish things that were said. Things like turning your life and your will over to the care of God. Things like admitting that your life is unmanageable. Making amends. Crazy, crazy exercises that these people went through. But the thing that affected me the most was that the kind of people that she was dragging in were not particularly the kind of people that I wanted the neighbors to see coming to our house. And she would bring people in that were just gross, and they would be drunk, ladies, and they'd sit on the couch, or there'd be some guys, and some men would bring them in, AA members, and they'd sit on the couch. And I've been there many a time, when they would watch the clock, and they would say, "Can we make it 5 minutes more?" And they'd pour orange juice and honey down those people, and black coffee, and they would just walk the floor, hour after hour after hour. "Let's make it 5 minutes more." And poor old guy'd be shaking so bad, his bones would be rattling. And he'd say, I'm going to try. So I had suggested to her from time to time that if she was going to have any contact with these people, that I thought that it would be appropriate if she would please scald all of the dishes that they drank out of, because they might have some kind of a disease that could be transmitted to the rest of us in the family. And that was my attitude towards AA members. Well, I don't know when I became an alcoholic. I took my first drink when I was 16 years old. I had an alcoholic mind from the time of birth. There's some speaker that I heard someplace that best describes the way I was. And I think he was from either North or South Carolina. I never could get those states straight. But anyway, he said that it's like taking a box of instant mashed potatoes, and you just pour the hot water in, and boom, you've got mashed potatoes. And that's the way I was with my personality, and I got the liquid, and boom, I just turned into an alcoholic. But my mind had always functioned as an alcoholic, clear back as far as I can remember. The most important thing to me in my adolescent years was to be accepted by my peer group, to be recognized as an equal, and I knew that I was not nearly as good as. I couldn't take kids home with me from school because I didn't know what the conditions might be. Mother might be in jail. And, that's a good topic of conversation in study hall at school. And so I kind of was isolated on the account of I never was able to share my home and have, little girls come over and spend the night and all of those things. I was kind of a loner. But in order for me to be accepted in my peer group, I figured out in my mind the thing that I've got to do is to achieve scholastically. And so I set about to do that in my early days. And I studied and I studied and I studied. And it was not easy. Some of it didn't come easy at all. But the most important thing to me was make the grade, to make the grades. And I knew that if I could do that, then perhaps I could go on to college and on a scholarship. And so whatever it took to make the grades and to make the honor society and the this and the that is what I did. And I stopped at nothing. I remember one time with an alcoholic mind, I'd never had a drink of whiskey. But I had made a grade that was not an A on an English test. And I needed an A to make an A for the semester. And so I studied the circumstances, the grade book. I studied the ink. I got some ink eradicator. And I studied the situation, plotting and planning. You know, with an alcoholic, you think of something over 3 seconds and it's a plot. I studied this situation, and so one day the teacher went to lunch. And that was my opportunity. And so I slipped into the classroom and I took the ink eradicator, and I'd practiced writing like the teacher for many weeks. And I got the ink pen, the exact ink that she had, and I changed that grade and I put an A, and it really looked good. It did. You couldn't even tell the difference. The only problem was that there was the geometry teacher had walked down the hall and looked in the window, and she had seen someone in tampering with a grade book. And so my English class was right after lunch. And so, apparently, the two teachers communicated. And so, in English class, my English teacher did this, and I went up to the class. She handed me a note. She said, "Take this to Mrs. Gordon." I took the note out in the hall, and I opened it up, and it said, "Is this the girl?" Well, you know how alcoholics are. And I'd never even had a drink in my life. So, I just took the note and went into the girls' restroom. And I found this great big fat girl. And she had black hair. And I said, "I'll give you 50 cents if you'll take this note into Miss Gordon." And she did. And Miss Gordon responded and wrote no. And she brought the note back out. I gave her 50 cents, and I took it back to Miss Lincoln. I got off scot-free, and here I am. Now, I tell that story so that you will know how I thought constantly for years before I came into this program. That's just the way my brain didn't work like anyone else's, you know? That's the way, it's constantly just a conspiracy going on in every direction at all times. And that's the way that I lived my life. That's the way that I made my grades in school. That's the way I went on to college. I would go to any length in order to obtain the objective or the goal, in order just to be recognized as equal, just to be as good as the rest of the kids. Because I knew if they really knew me and really knew where I came from, that they wouldn't like me. And so when I got to college, it wasn't enough for me just to be on the dean's honor roll. I had to be on the president's honor roll. And I'd steal exams and I'd cheat. I'd do whatever, crawling in windows, getting the exams out of the teacher's office. And, I never did get caught. And that was the easy way, the dishonest, crooked way. But I want to tell you something, it paid off, because they thought I was just brilliant, making straight A's every semester. And little did they know the Jekyll and Hyde that was really going on with me. I drank in college, socially, got drunk, blacked out, did all of the dumb things that we do. Went on to law school. And it was in law school that I was sitting next, I enrolled in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And I was sitting next to a doctor. And I was complaining I was working, but they call it on the Hill. And I had gotten a job with an Oklahoma congressman from home. And so I was working in the daytime, sending myself to law school, and so I was tired. And I commented to the doctor that, it was really a grueling day. And he said, "Have some of these." And he took a bottle out of his pocket, and they had little orange triangular pills in there. And he gave me the whole bottle. And it was just marvelous. And I was studying for finals. And so, after the finals were over, I said to the doctor, I really started liking him. And so I said to the doctor, why don't you give me a prescription for these? These really do help me get through the day. Well, what I was doing was taking 5 milligrams of amphetamine. And so he gave me an open-ended prescription. And so from that day on, I had an open prescription running at the drugstore. And as we all know, those of us who have been through this, that you start out with 5 milligrams and you end up, you know, you're taking 130 a day. You just eat them like popcorn, like M&Ms, just, you know, drinking the coffee, and then at night having to come down and I would have to drink myself into oblivion. And I was in that squirrel cage, just round and round and round and round, making all of the parties and everything in Washington, and my world just came tumbling down, and I knew that something was going to have to give. So I returned to the University of Oklahoma, and I finished my last year of law school there, and I moved back home so that I could have some kind of stability. I had absolutely no self-discipline. And at least Mom was sober now in AA, and you know, I kind of vicariously was getting a little bit of self-discipline just from being around her. When I graduated from law school, I went to work for a federal judge of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. That's when we went to Denver. That's when I went to the AA meeting, because I had gotten drunk in the Brown Palace Hotel, and a lot of federal judges were in there, and I'd made a complete fool out of myself. And I knew that in order to save my job, I thought I'd better go to an AA meeting so that at least I could tell them that I had been. But of course, I was using it. I was not serious. I went. And at that meeting, I didn't hear anything that those people talked about when they talked about emotional identification. The things that I heard them say were things like, you're an alcoholic if you go to jail. You're an alcoholic if you're arrested on a DUI or DWI or 502 or whatever you call it. You're an alcoholic if you have to go to a sanitarium and dry out. You're an alcoholic if you lose your job, you lose your family, etc., etc., etc. And none of those things had ever happened to me. And so I left. I said, I'm not one. I got the world by the tail. Maybe I drink a little bit too much, but certainly I know so much about alcoholism and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I am so intellectually superior, and I can sit and talk to these AA members that there is no way that I will ever be one, because I have the insurance intellectually not to be. And I was convinced of that, convinced that I would never be one, because I knew what roads not to take. The things that you all did, I wouldn't make the same mistakes. Well, as time went on, I ended up, I had gotten married, I had 3 children, and this was drinking constantly. And so we had to do a geographic. And we moved to California because my mother was beginning to bother me. She kept showing up at the house, and I'd have to hide my glass, you know, and this would be 2 in the afternoon when you shouldn't be having a drink. And so I was trying to raise those kids, and I had 3 kids in, 4 years. And that kind of interrupts your career. The doctor said, it's just like shelling peas. And so instead of hitting the law books, there I was, trying to read Dr. Spock, feed the kids, and pablum and strain peaches and all that stuff, and be a mother and be domesticated. And it interrupted, I thought, my career, my profession, and certainly my drinking habits. And so we moved to Van Nuys, California, and I was married to a man who was in the media business and research media marketing. And so that seemed like a good place to live in North Hollywood, and so we moved out there, and I thought things would be different. And I started trying to exercise controlled drinking. But as progressive and as insidious as this disease is, it's upon us before we know it. And I thought, well, I won't have a drink before 5 o'clock in the evening. And then my mind reasoned with me, well, here in California, it's 2 o'clock, but it's 5 o'clock in New York. So I'd have a drink New York time. And then pretty soon, I knew that it was like 5 o'clock in England. So I'd have a drink starting in the morning. And I rationalized this away, that it was perfectly acceptable to get up in the morning and start with Bloody Marys or whatever, and just to continue drinking throughout the day. And I put my kids into nursery school. I did everything that I could to relieve myself of the responsibility of really caring for those children. And then in the evening when they had come home, I'd get their dinner for them. But you see, then I would like to sit and have a couple of drinks before dinner. As you well know, you never get around to eating. And so those children were in bed by 7:30. My oldest son said he had bed sores for 3 years. I always had him napping or in bed at night, one of the two, because it was easier to watch him that way. So I said to my husband, I've got to get out. If you'll get me out of here, if you'll just get me out of the valley with all of the smog and the heat and move me to the beach, I'll be better. I just need some peace and some tranquility. And so we moved down to Malibu, and nothing changed. And we lived in a beach house, and I just walked up and down the beach and drank. I started, back to church. I went to psychologists. I went to psychiatrists. I was doing everything that I could to find that missing part from the picture. I don't know what it was, but my life was not complete. And the paranoia, the depression, the loneliness, all of that had set in. The emotional degradation and the decay was taking place, and I had no idea what was going on in my life, except that I had the responsibility of a family and those 3 little kids, and I hated it all. We moved back into Van Nuys, and I had gone back to Alcoholics Anonymous in 1968 when we were living in Malibu, and I'd gone to a couple of meetings in Santa Monica. And I went in, and I remember that I locked myself in the ladies' restroom, locked the door. The AA women couldn't get in. And I just sat there and cried for 1 hour. I didn't go out. I didn't associate with anyone. I didn't talk to anyone. I just sat and cried. And I opened the door when the meeting was over, and my family picked me up, and I got in the car. I said, those are the most unfriendly people that I have ever met. Huh? And as is usual, you know what you do when you're beginning to doubt, could you possibly be an alcoholic? The best thing for you to do is ask one of your drinking buddies, because they're going to say, no, of course you're not. You just have problems, but no, you're not an alcoholic. On the account, they probably drink more than you do. And so that's what I would do. I would poll people, the people that I drank with, and they said, no, we don't think you're alcoholic. After we had moved back into Van Nuys, it just seemed like that I was on that roller coaster, and it's when you get right up to the top, when you take that first big dip. And man, I started down that acceleration, and it was quick and it was fast, and I don't know how it happened. But I know that we had moved into a transient apartment house. We were absolutely destitute financially. And we were sitting, and we had no furniture. It had been locked up because we had been evicted and from our home, and we had to pay the rent of the week. And we had the clothes on our back. And my oldest boy had been in 8 schools by the time he was in the 3rd grade. I'd done so many geographics. And all they had was their clothes, and so I had to wash daily. And I sat out on the steps of that horrible place, and they were concrete and iron. And there was no place for the kids to play. I had to cross the freeway with them after I jerked them out of school and go to some stupid little park, and I would sit in the park, and they would swing, and I would cry. And I spent day after day after day, barely having enough money to put food on the table, always enough money to buy wine, the cheapest wine, but I always had wine. And I couldn't get anything else, so I bought packages and packages of Sominex. And so I would eat the Sominex and drink the wine just to take the edge off, because I knew I was going to die. I sat out there this evening, and it was in November of 1968. And it just came out of my mouth. and I don't know why. And it was that universal prayer that every alcoholic utters. And I said, God, and you always want to qualify it. I said, God, if you were there, help me. Just help me. And nothing happened. Within the next few weeks, my husband obtained employment. We were able to move from that place. We moved into this lovely home in Van Nuys. And of course, I insisted on having a swimming pool, you understand, an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Now, I didn't even have a refrigerator to put the milk in, but I had to have a pool because it looked good. And so I took the kids' milk and poured it into the empty wine bottles and floated them in the swimming pool so the milk wouldn't spoil. Somehow or another, our perspective gets a little warped, you know. And so, in February, I had what they call the Hong Kong flu. I was sick for a couple of weeks. And a friend of mine came down who was living in Fresno, a little girl that I had gone to high school with. Her name was Paula Ann. Paula Ann's mother was an alcoholic. And Paula Ann and I understood each other. We graduated, gone all the way through high school. I could go to her house and her mother would be passed out drunk across the bed. And it didn't upset me. She could come to my house and my parents had been in a terrible fight and it didn't upset her. She probably was the closest friend that I had. And so Paula had married and she had 3 children. And she was the director of Little Theater in Fresno. Very talented young lady. And so she came to see me in Los Angeles. And we sat there drinking and with her cousin, another friend of ours, and they left, and the cousin called me the next day and said, you know, Paula Ann is very upset. Yvonne, she thinks that you're an alcoholic. And I don't think anything ever has crushed me as much as Paula, that comment. And so, I don't know what happened, except that for the next week or so, I continued to drink. And on February the 11th, I was drunk, and it was evening, and I all of a sudden became as lucid as I am right now. My body was drunk, but my mind was clear. And I got up and I went in and I dialed the operator, and I said, get me Alcoholics Anonymous. That's the hardest phone call that I have ever made. I was the one who was supposed to understand the disease of alcoholism. The people that I detested, looked down upon, degraded, made fun of, I called them the stinking, puking drunks. All of my life, I had made fun of you all. However, it was a matter of convenience for my mother to associate with her because she got her life straightened out. And yet that night, I had to call those stinking, puking drunks to come and help me. They answered at the clubhouse and they said, where do you live? And I told them, and they said, do you think you have a drinking problem? And within 1/10 of a second, my arrogance returned, and I said, well, why do you think I'm calling? You know. They were very kind, and they came. One had been sober 5 years, one 9 years, and one 3 months. The one who had been sober 3 months had lost her children through court action because she was an unfit mother. I didn't want to talk to the people with a 5 and 9 year track record. I wanted to talk to that girl that had been sober 3 months. And a lot of times you will hear old-timers say, well, you haven't been sober long enough to go on a 12-step call. Baloney. People who are drinking do not understand, in some instances, 5 years of sobriety. My question to this girl was, how have you stayed sober 3 months? 3 long months. And she said, I do it one day at a time. I'd heard that all my life. But that was the first time I heard it. It never made sense to me. And I want to say this. God bless those people. I feel so fortunate and so grateful that when the time came for me to take that first step and to make that surrender, I was blessed with people in Alcoholics Anonymous who came at 10 o'clock at night who came in and said, Yvonne, if you want to drink, that's your business. If you want to quit drinking, that's our business. And they asked me questions, and they told me about what had happened to them. And they did the 12-step work as it is described in the big book. I was blessed with those kind of AA members rather than a group coming in and the first question out of their mouths, which would have been, do you have any hospitalization? And I didn't. And I got sober with those people that night. And they called the next morning, and they called all day long. And they picked me up and carried me to meetings night after night after night. And they dedicated their lives to me, and they gave me phone numbers to call, and I called total strangers my first day of sobriety. And I said, I am new, my last drink was yesterday, and I want to drink. And people that I had never seen before talked to me. Lawyers, they said, call these lawyers. And they talked to me, and they took time out of their lives. And they said, when you want to drink, if you will call, we promise you that after you have talked to someone in AA for a minute, the compulsion will go away. And so I stayed on that phone all day long. And they talked me through that day, and I went to my first meeting, and I sat there that night in North Hollywood, and they had a funny old beer sign that they had painted over, and it said, we care. And no one had ever said that to me before, because no one did. No one ever cared. And so I started in on my rebirth in this program. I did exactly as I was told to do, with a great deal of resentment. I immediately informed everyone in the clubhouse of who I was, and that I knew everything that there was to know about Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, you can imagine someone 3 days sober saying, well, now, you know, when I remember when the traditions were written, you know. And so they, in their infinite wisdom, knew how to handle me. And today I call it tough love. Because they said things to me like, well, you see, I explained to them that I had a doctorate of jurisprudence degree. And they said things to me like, well, if you're so smart, how come you're a drunk? And one old man said, I know something else that has a lot of degrees. It's a rectal thermometer. They said, leave your head outside, that's what got you here. And then the real clincher. We have known a lot of people who are too smart to make this program, but no one's ever been too dumb. And they said, you sit down and you shut up and you listen. You have nothing to say. And that's what I did for 1 year, and I hated them. I hated those people. And that I'd have to carry the coffee cups back, and yuck, and I'd have to empty the ashtrays, and I did all the mundane servitude things, and they didn't know I was important. But I did as I was told. You see, because there was one thing that they had going for them, which allowed me to let them superimpose their inferior intellect over mine. And that was that they were sober, and that I couldn't stay sober. So I had to do the things that I was told to do. I went to a minimum of 5 meetings a week. And there they were, the steps on the wall, and it was magical. It was the group therapy, I think. The strength of the group. We admitted, we came to believe. Everything in AA, in our steps, is written in the plurality, which is the group strength. And we used our mouths to get sick, and now we use them to get well. It was the sharing and the kindness and the tough love and the understanding and the willingness to listen. Many's the night I've stayed after meetings and talked until the wee hours with the older members of AA, and they said, stick with the winners. That's vital. Find someone that you don't really like and ask them to be your sponsor. And the sponsor that I had picked was from Alabama, and she had been sober 18 years, and she had cut a few pretty wild didos herself. And so there wasn't really much that I could do, or say to put anything over on her. She told me what I was thinking most of the time, and she didn't put up with any monkey business at all. And she said, this is the way it is, and these are the things that you are going to do. And so I said, well, I can't sleep at night. I'm going through this thing. I just can't sleep. I really need some sleeping pills. And she said, no one ever died from the lack of sleep in Alcoholics Anonymous, but we do. She said, honey, we do occasionally die from taking those sleeping pills. And I'm going to say the same thing to you that she said to me. If you are new in this program, Alcoholics Anonymous and sobriety mean complete and total chemical abstinence. No funny cigarettes, no pills, nothing, absolutely nothing. And from area to area and place to place, you run across small groups who think sometimes it's okay to do that. Because I have heard people say, and look me in the eye and say, the book of Alcoholics Anonymous just talks about alcohol. And I say to you, those people are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. Well, I guess really I had a Cinderella story after that. I was off and running. I moved back to the state of Oklahoma. I'd been sober, and I was going to AA, and I told her, I said, I don't think I can go back to that rotten state and go to those AA meetings because my mother's friends go. And she said to me, you can stay sober any place. She said, honey, you can stay sober any place in this world if you have the desire and a big book. And that pretty well puts the responsibility on you. I was never allowed any latitude or any license to cop out on anything. I always had to look at it like it was, no excuses. You see, when I came into the program, I was an expert, an absolute expert at rationalizing and compensating everything that I had ever done. I could give you a rational excuse for every act. I could explain away. You see, that's called an alcoholic mind. When we drink at people, places, and things, we can always excuse our behavior. I really wasn't in very good physical shape when I came to the program. I weighed 170 pounds. If I had rolled over, I'd been in Cleveland. And I had reached the point where I was afraid to go to the door. I couldn't answer the telephone. I couldn't go to the grocery store without drinking and before I went and make a decision. There wasn't anything that I belonged to. Not, there was no part. I remember one time I wanted so much just to be accepted. While I was still drinking, I picked up the newspaper there when we were in Van Nuys, and I read that they were having a flying saucer convention. So I thought, well, I'm going to go to that, and maybe I'll meet someone, and they'll take me home. And so I got drunk, and I went to the UFO convention. By myself, driving, and I went in, and there were, you think AA's weird. There were people in long flowing white robes, and flowers and beads, and this, remember California, big conference. And some lady got up and she opened the meeting and she sang the Star Spangled Banner. And I was in the back of the room drunk, and I said, hey lady, sing Fly Me to the Moon. and they asked me to leave. That's as bad as you can get. I brought all of that neuroses and that strange conduct. You know, I never acted normal, really. And I never did anything to get in trouble with the law. It's just that whatever I did was so bizarre. I went to when we were living in Malibu, I went to a very fancy PTA meeting because I thought maybe I can join the PTA and the ladies will like me. And I got up there a little bit early because I wanted to be accepted, and I hadn't been drinking. And so the lady said to me, "Would you mind mixing the punch? Do you know how?" I said, "Sure." And it was a very beautiful home, and she took me into the safe, and oh my gosh, there was whiskey every place. And she said, "Here's the recipe, and there's the punch bowl," and it was just everywhere. And so I read that recipe, and you know how lawyers are. I mean, we're going to read it, just exactly what it means. And it said, you put in lemon juice, blah, blah, blah. And it said, 4, and a slash mark, 5, vodka. Now, anyone who's intellectual is going to know that 4/5 of a quart is a fifth of vodka. Not me. That said 4/5 of vodka. So I mixed the 4/5 of vodka, and the ladies loved it, and we fixed 2 or 3 batches. And we ran out of lemons, and we had on high heels, and we started climbing the lemon trees. And by the time we had that PTA meeting, it was a cat fight. They were pulling each other's hair out. And they never asked me back. About the only thing that I haven't been thrown out of is Alcoholics Anonymous, you know? I just never made my niche socially anywhere. Well, we had moved back to Oklahoma, and my Cinderella story took off. I went to work. All of a sudden, I was employable, and I could read law books, and I could write checks, and I could get it together. And so I became Assistant Attorney General in the Criminal Division, and I started putting people in jail and trying cases where lives had been taken by defendants who were drunk. And every day thinking, there but for the grace of God. I had been guilty of child abuse when I was drinking. I had done all the things. They say that the definition of an alcoholic is someone who cannot predict what their behavior is going to be after their first drink. And I remember I used to go to meetings, and I was so condescending, and people would get up and tell things from the podium. And my sponsor would sit there and give me that definition, and she would say, therefore, she said, if you can't predict what your behavior can be after the first drink, then you are capable of doing anything else that any other alcoholic has done. And she said, don't you ever sit in the seat of condemnation or judgment again. And so my mind was opened, and I became aware from the beginning that there but for the grace of God, anything I could have done. And so I was working, putting people in jail, trying to keep them there. And in 1973, I was appointed to the bench, the first female in our state that ever served. And you talk about cocky, arrogant. I'm going to tell you, I hadn't been sober that long. And I thought I had ascended to the bench. In 1972, it had become necessary that I get a divorce from the gentleman that I had married. That night, when those 3 people came, they made one statement which is so true. They said, if you don't, they had recommended that he go to Al-Anon. They said, if you don't grow together in this program, you will grow apart. And that's exactly what happened. On account of my values changed, my beliefs changed, my life changed, the things that were important to me, the ideals, my goals in living were all different. He was married to a different woman. And somehow things just started falling apart. And though it seemed devastating to me at the time, it was necessary that that marriage end in order that I could go ahead and pursue my life really soberly. And so I became very involved in AA, and I, became the president of AA in Oklahoma City. Self-appointed. And I was sponsoring people and going to meetings and doing this and that, and the local guru. And so I had met a gentleman who had practiced in my court, and he was a very nice man, and he was an excellent attorney, and I had said to myself, when I grow up, I'd like to be a lawyer like that. He's that good. And so we had exchanged just the weather and so forth off at the bench, and kept a great distance. They don't let you associate with lawyers. You're not supposed to, Boy, did I fool them. And so anyway, I had a dog. I had moved to the country with the children, and I was solely financially responsible, raising those 3 kids. I'm the one who couldn't stand responsibility, and here I am, being a mother and a father, going to AA meetings, basketball games, baseball games, I got to join the PTA there. I was doing it all, superwoman. And so I had a dog because we lived in the country, and so my dog came in heat. It was a Great Dane, and in conversation with him, I had learned that he had a male Great Dane, and he was a widower. He had 4 children. And so I called him up one night and said, you think maybe our dogs could get together? And so he brought his dog over to my house, and I put my dog in my car, and we went to the kennels. And the dogs got married, and 3 months later we did. And I had no idea that man drank whiskey. Because if you're the president of AA, and you're an expert, and you know everything, then you can recognize an alcoholic walking down the street. And I didn't even know that man drank. Little did I know, but he was a full-blown periodic. And so I would go off on AA conferences, and all the time that I was gone on the AA conference, he's laying home drunk. And he'd send my children over to my mother's, and she'd take care of him, and he would tell her that he had to work, and he'd just go hole up someplace and just lay around drunk. And then he would sober up before I came in. This one weekend after weekend after weekend. I had to leave town to go hold court in other towns. We had a circuit, and we rode the circuit. And he was so glad when I'd get ready to cut out, because it meant drinking days, and yet I never saw him drink. And he was so slick at concealing that. I had absolutely no idea that he would try to figure out ways that he could call up members of Alcoholics Anonymous and get them to invite me to conferences. And offer to pay my way. So I'd leave so he could drink. Well, all I knew was he was crazy. It wasn't working out. The marriage was falling apart. My kids didn't like him. He was nuts. I didn't like his kids. They didn't like me, the whole thing. It's a bunch of tomcats in a tow sack. And so every time I'd get ready to go to an AA conference, he'd always start a fight. It would be a terrible fight, and he would act horrible. And so I would say to the guys in AA, I don't understand what's wrong with him. If he just drank, he has the personality of an alcoholic. If he just drank, and we could get him into this program. Well, he would always start the fights, and I would leave and go on to the AA meetings. And so my oldest son was speaker at an Al-Anon conference over in Arkansas, and we were to go on a Friday morning, and we got up to leave, and my husband started a fight. Just picked a fight with me. And so I took my children in my car, and I went to my AA conference. Just left it. And so on the way over there, I never liked Al-Anons. Because they're little women that they go to open meetings with their husbands and they sit and they jab them. And they say, "Get that." And then they look at AA women funny. As though we're trying to steal that dumb thing they're married to. And you wouldn't have them if they gave them to you. So I kept my distance from the Al-Anons, but I had attended enough AA conferences and had forced myself to go listen to some of those little Al-Anon ladies. It's like the woman's sewing circle, I thought. But I had listened to their language, and they had a thing. It was kind of, I don't know, it was an attraction. And so they talked about release and what they did with their families. I didn't know what to do in that situation, and so on my way over to Arkansas, I just prayed, and I said, God, I don't know, God. When I really have my back to the wall, they say when you're on your back, the only way is to look is up. I said, God, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to pray. I got a situation. I said, I don't know, why is it in my life that I can never have a lasting human relationship with a human being? Is there something wrong with me? I don't know what the problem is. It just seems as though when I go to AA conferences, we have a big problem in our marriage. He doesn't want me to participate in AA. And if I've got to choose between him and the marriage and AA, I've got to take AA. I can't quit because I've got to go to the meetings. And I said, you do something with him. Just take him and do something with him. I didn't know that was Al-Anon release. We came back from the conference. Lo and behold, I found out at a later date that the reason that we always had the fights when I was going to the conferences is because periodics are really weird drinkers. If any of you people are married to periodics, God bless you. They store things in their minds. They pigeonhole them. They will go along 3 weeks and make up reasons that people to get drunk. And, I never did that. I just drank every day because if you got a problem, you get it on and you just drink, Periodics don't do that. And so what he was doing with me was starting the argument. He was finding an excuse to get drunk. And I thought it was because he didn't want me to go. And he was actually getting ready to go on his binge, which he wanted to go on, but he didn't have any reason to. So you have to manufacture a whole script. We had a complete and total lack of communication. And so I don't understand periodics any more than I do social drinkers. To this day, I don't. But anyway, I came home from that conference and I walked in, and my little old kids, we'd just been rejected so much. We walked into the bathroom, we opened up the closet, and his clothes were gone. The little kids just stood there, and they said, "Well, Mother," I said, "we got another one that did it." I said, "Well," I went in, I found a note on the bed, and it was drunkenly scrawled, and he says, "I love you more than anything, but I cannot live with you." And so he said, "Call me." He had gone to the farm. So I called him, and he said, "I've had a terrible wreck." And he was driving a little MGB with a cloth rag top, and he had rolled that car and 3 times, and it had scooted like 40 feet on its top. And he was so drunk he didn't strap himself in. If he did, he would have been killed, and it threw him out in the ditch. And the police had come, and they couldn't find him. And he came to, and he heard him saying, "There's got to be a body around here somewhere." And so he crawled in the weeds and hid. And they left, and then he crawled up through the woods, went to the house. They got the license tag. They called the house. He was still drunk. They said, "We're coming up." And so he knew, that slick lawyer, geez, he knew not to be there, and so he escaped. and went out and hid in the woods and had one of his daughters pick him up and take him to the farm. Now here I come home, and I'm thinking, my God, it's going to make the front page. Here he is running from the law. It's my job to turn him in. You know, he's a fugitive from justice. And so I called him, and he told me this terrible thing that happened. I said, are you hurt? And he said, I don't think so. And he said, but I haven't had anything to eat in 3 days. I said, well, just a minute. Being the alcoholic, with my mind, you know, we fix it all. Fixers. So I called my Al-Anon ladies, and I said, well, listen to this. Gave them the whole spiel. I said, now, what am I supposed to do? And that stupid Al-Anon said, nothing. I said, what do you mean, nothing? She said, nothing. You leave him alone. She said, has he had so much he's going to convulse? I said, I don't think so. I said, but he's starving. She said, tell him to go beg some food. So I called him back up. I said, go to the neighbors and beg some food. I wouldn't let him come home. He said, I haven't had any coffee. I said, go but beg some coffee. Well, his daughter, who had picked him up in the woods, who had transported him there, her name is Leslie, she knew her daddy well enough as a drunk that she knew to take the car keys, the truck keys, the whole thing, and from the farm. And so he had started the next morning, and we live in a very small town, and he was going to drive the tractor down Main Street to the liquor store. And so that was his introduction into this program, and he said, would you please call someone in Alcoholics Anonymous? And I said, no, you call him. He said, I can't. I broke my glasses in the wreck. I said, tell me who you want, and I'll look up the number. So I gave him the telephone numbers, and he didn't call, and he called me the next morning. He said, I'm so sick. I cannot go to work. Would you tell him that I'm just very ill and I've got the flu? So I called his law firm. The lawyers answered, and I said, Henry is at the farm. He's wrecked the car, and he's drunk. Click. He came by that night for a cup of soup, and he went to his first AA meeting. He did another periodic on me when I went to another AA conference, but as of May of this last year, he has 12 years now. And the daughter who found him in the woods, who knew what to do, came in a year later and has 11 years. My youngest daughter, who is my baby, overprotected. She came down here with me to Galveston. To Corpus Christi, I think, didn't she? Little bitty thing. Well, she decided that she was going to follow in her mother's footsteps, and she started at an early age. And she was expelled from school for drugs, and I enrolled her in a church school. And you Al-Anon ladies can see exactly the route that we take. I enrolled her in the proper school. I was going to select her friends. And she was expelled from the church school for drugs, and she was allowed to graduate, so I decided that I would send her to Oklahoma Baptist University, where she could associate with Baptists. And the only problem was that all of the parents in Oklahoma were sending their kids there for the same reason. And it was a complete madhouse circus. And those kids were doing everything. So I went over and I pulled her out of that school, and I decided I would send her to another school. And so I enrolled her in Central State University, and we got her first semester grades, and she made an F in everything for non-attendance. And so I brought her home, and that was it. I said, put your things in a cardboard box. So I started the discipline and the supervision and my finger in her face, and And so she stayed sober for 6 months. She couldn't live at home. She went down to Norman and lived with some AA friends of mine, and she made a commitment that she would do it for 6 months. And She picked up her 6 months chip. In the morning, the day after that, she disappeared. Now, you have to understand that my oldest son, the Alateen speaker, you wouldn't like him. He's always had an objective and a goal. He's Jack Armstrong. He does not drink. He does not smoke. He has never used a marijuana cigarette. He's never had a drug in his body. He's always wanted to go into law enforcement, so he majored in criminal justice, and he graduated from the university and was accepted as one of 2 agents for the State Narcotics Bureau. And he's the youngest that they've ever hired. So I got one kid out that's chopping it on weekends and one kid that's smoking it. And we had a hell of a time keeping them apart, I'll tell you. Well, she disappeared, and I didn't hear from her, and she showed up, like for Thanksgiving. She was living out of her car, and, and it'd break down. She was hitchhiking and all of the things. So I immediately took control, and I rented her apartment. I got her car fixed. I got her a job. I bought her clothes. I. And I got her fixed. And within 2 months, she had been evicted from the apartment. Whoever her boyfriend was, had torn up her car. She had all of her clothes and everything else stolen, and she was fired from her job. She was back out. And I kept going to Al-Anon. I was dying. She was the pride of my life, a beautiful child. And so the Al-Anons kept saying, release, release. And I couldn't do it. It is one thing to be able to release a spouse. It's quite different to release a child that you've carried. And I couldn't do it. And I would cry at night. I would go out. My poor husband, we spent thousands of dollars in gasoline just out looking for her all night long. Just driving, looking for her. And we could never find her. And so it just got to the point that the only kind of prayer that I could say is, I said, God, just keep her breathing. I don't care. I knew they'd find her alongside the road, maimed, mutilated, raped. It didn't matter to me. I said, God, just keep her breathing, because if she's breathing, she's salvageable. She's salvageable. And that's all I could pray. I didn't know how to do anything else. Her birthday came and went. I made no effort to find her. It seems as though the only way sometimes that you can hang on is to let go. And when I let go, and when I gave up, she gave up. And a couple of days after her birthday, the phone rang 2 or 3 in the morning, and I answered it. And she said, Mama, and she was crying. And she said, I'm willing to go to any lengths. And that little girl is now 25 and has 5 years in this program. She's married and has 18-month-old granddaughter who's won 2 beauty contests. And she's brilliant. She's going to read next week. And my daughter's pregnant again. That about did me in. But I have learned so much about life, about surrender, about love and commitment. I hadn't experienced all of the emotions that some of you have, because I just had never been in the proper place. And it wasn't until last October, a year ago, that my daddy died. And we were very close, because we'd poured out the whiskey, and we'd put up with Mother, and all these years, and so I was the only one who was there, able to go to the hospital to be with him there towards the end. And it's the first time that I have ever experienced the emotion of grief. And it was through this program that I began to understand, because again, I can only utter a simple prayer. Mine are one-liners. And I just said, God, don't let him suffer. Just don't let him suffer. And that prayer was answered. And I have no complaint. And he was a wonderful man. And it was quick. Then that was in October. In December, you talk about life-saving. In December, through some bizarre set of circumstances, I detected and was diagnosed as having cancer. And I went to the doctor, and miraculously enough, because of the coincidence of the diagnosis, which was God's script, they said to me, if you wake up in the outpatient ward, you can go home. If you wake up in the hospital, you got problems. And I woke up in the hospital. And the reason I tell you this is because, you see, it makes a big difference in your program. On the count of, if any of you have ever been there, it is the most dehumanizing feeling that there is, because you no longer are a patient. It's not as though you were sick and in the hospital, because the medical profession automatically casts you aside and you become a statistic. And they come into you and they give you numbers, and they say, well, chances of your recovery are 50%, or they're 70%, or if we find this wrong, 75%. And so I kept passing all of the tests and passing all of the tests. The longest time that I had to spend was that 36 hours to find out if I was in the 50-50 group. And I have gone to meetings and heard people say, oh, it's just wonderful. I just want to stay sober so that I can start living again. And for 36 hours, all that I wanted to do was just live so that I could stay sober. And that happened. And for some reason or another, God has given me a miraculous recovery, because my recovery rate is 96%, and that's greater than my chances are of staying sober in AA. But your perspective changes, and my friends, you don't sweat the little things anymore. There ain't no big deals. And you go a day at a time, and you're just grateful for every breath that you take. I always close with this story, because I've heard so many speakers get up to the podium and they say so many wild statements, and they say, oh, well, I work this program each day to the best of my ability. Well, you know, none of us do that. And they say, oh, well, I just don't have a drink left in me. I do. You know, I don't know whether I have another recovery. But then they say, I have a choice of whether I'm going to drink or not drink. Untrue. You don't have a choice as to whether you're going to drink or not drink. At least I don't. I have a choice as to whether I'm going to live or die. Because drinking to me is dying. And I know that's what will happen. As with young people, God bless you, there was a group of rebellious young people who belonged to a tribe. And there was one old wise man in that tribe, and he, at the tribal council meetings, was always asked for his wisdom. He was sagacious. And so the young people were trying to rebel and prove him to be a fool. And they said, we will go to the tribal meeting this evening, and we're going to take a bird, and we'll hold it in our hand. And we're going to ask the old man what it is, and he's going to tell us. And then we're going to ask him if it's alive or if it's dead. And if that old man says that the bird is alive, we're going to break its neck. But if the old man says that the bird is dead, we're going to open up our hand and let it fly away. And they went to the meeting and they took the bird. And they said, old man, oh man, what is this? And he said, it's a bird. And they said, is it alive or is it dead? And the old man paused and he said, the choice is yours. And I say to you, friends, living or dying, the choice is yours.